Nearly 7 years after the first Hellblade game was released as a timed console exclusive on PlayStation 4, Hellblade 2 has finally arrived as a landmark Xbox exclusive. And while Ninja Theory gave the world a great looking game back in 2017, they've delivered an absurdly beautiful work of art here in 2024. But it's not without some serious flaws. In setting out to build such an impressive looking game, it's clear that the scope of the story had to be narrow and the complexity of the gameplay severely limited. The game keeps the player on a pretty straightforward track from beginning to end, and does very little to iterate on the mechanics introduced in the first Hellblade game. In fact, in some ways, the gameplay here has actually had a downgrade. I tried to imagine how I'd feel about the game if it had janky Xbox 360 level graphics rather than the beautiful next-gen visuals on show. And in that case, I feel like what we're left with is actually a pretty disappointing experience. As a focused 6 to 8 hour long game, I feel like I should have been left wanting more, but instead I felt like the game dragged on for a bit too long. I do think Hellblade 2 is a stunning work of art, but I don't think it's an especially good video game, to such an extent that it left me wondering why this story needs to be a video game at all. What does it do to justify being an interactive experience? Because when you really dig into the gameplay here, it's very simple and very repetitive. Before I get into discussing that gameplay though, and where else it falls apart, I think it's only fair to point out the things that the game does well. And for what it's worth, I'll be doing so without any major spoilers too.
Everyone, help us. Do you want to join them?
You came here to help.
Let's go.
Listen to yourself.
What is beyond there is too dark.
We are leaving. Now.
Hellblade 2 does a lot of things well, and chief among them, of course, is looking great. I would struggle honestly to point out any issues with the overall visual presentation in the game. It's not really my area of expertise to talk graphics, but regardless, I don't think I've ever seen such an immaculate and consistent image in a game. And though achieving that has clearly meant limiting the scope of the game in many other ways, it's undeniable that Ninja Theory have created one of the best looking games of all time here. Not just because of the technical prowess on show either, but also because of the insane attention to detail and the thoughtful art and lighting design. 30 FPS on consoles might put some people off, but I found that the slow pace of the game made it feel perfect to me. And the widescreen aspect ratio, which clearly helped them save some processing power, looks great too. All of this visual goodness serves to emphasize the beautiful and fantastical and disturbing 9th century Iceland that Ninja Theory have crafted, and to establish the unnerving tone which is probably the game's strongest aspect in my eyes. Regardless of story or gameplay, everything definitely comes together here to transport you to another world, which is all at once picturesque and terrifying. Aside from the visuals, the sound design has been the most widely touted impressive feature of the game. I played for a couple of hours using headphones, so I can attest that the binaural audio is striking, and will certainly convince you that you're losing your mind if that's the effect you want. I personally prefer to play with surround sound though, as I usually do, and even in that case, the spatial effects, both from the voices and the world, sounded great to me. I think, however you want to play it, you'll have a good experience with the sound here. Without spoiling any specific plot details, I feel I also have to talk about the story here, which I think I personally preferred to the first games, but can also concede that it's weaker than that original story, primarily because it feels less intimately tied to Senua's personal journey. I was under the impression that the game would offer its spin on a familiar revenge plot, given the way it started. Senua makes her way to Iceland apparently to find the Vikings who enslaved her people and destroyed her home, and to serve up some justice. and I was very much on board for that story. It seemed like it would be the perfect platform for giving us some new, exciting combat scenarios, and eventually further catharsis for Senua. But it doesn't actually pan out like that at all. The story very quickly becomes about helping the native people reclaim their land from the Draugrs, who are scary bad guys, and from giants, who are scary giant guys. And though it loops back to Senua's original intent when arriving in Iceland and her personal journey, it is not chiefly driven by her desire for revenge. Nor does it offer startling revelations about Senua's life or introduce characters from her past, unfortunately. Still though, I liked the story overall better than the first game, mostly because it has Senua interacting with other people and in a more grounded reality. It's definitely still otherworldly because we still see things from Senua's sometimes indecipherable perspective, but although it's sometimes hard to know what exactly is happening, it all flows well and just feels more real. I'm certainly not wholly convinced though by the way that Senua sort of just appears here and by chance ends up fighting giants, and seemingly losing interest in the original goal that sent her to Iceland. It just all overall makes her personal struggle with her mental health feel a lot less relevant than it did in the first game. I don't feel qualified to talk about the depictions of mental health issues in the game, but I do commend the studio for their commitment to being sensitive with these issues. I can try to speak to the quality of the storytelling in that area though, and in that sense, I'll simply say that Senua's psychosis is handled in a very similar way to the first game, but because it feels less integral to the plot, it feels more often distracting than it is engaging. I understand why they've handled it this way, and I do think at times it can be very unnerving and help set the tone. But at other times it feels like someone doing a bad Gollum impression in the corner of the room. It sometimes left me feeling like I was surrounded by a group of friends shouting pointless commentary at me while I was trying to focus on the game. Sometimes they offer hints for puzzles, sometimes they offer helpful reminders of plot details, but mostly they just repeat things over and over again and tell Senua how useless she is. Maybe that's what the developers wanted here. Maybe they wanted me to be frustrated by the voices in my head, like Senua probably is. But I don't remember feeling like that with the first game, and ultimately, I think I would have preferred Hellblade II with less of it, because it felt like it was pulling me out of the game more often than it was immersing me in Senua's world and her story. It will certainly have a different effect on different people, but I personally felt that the voices weren't as authentic or necessary as they were in the first game. All that said though, I still just about place the game's story in the good pile overall. The ending definitely did feel a bit abrupt and anticlimactic, almost like a whole sequence had been cut there, but I still think the whole thing feels expansive and intriguing, and there's almost certainly more of Senua's story to be told down the line. I do wish it was easier to make sense of the plot and Senua's motivations though, and I also think it's unfortunate that the pacing of gameplay takes so much momentum out of the story.
It's there. Focus. You found it. You found it. Focus.
Know how deep this darkness goes.
Yes, you've done it. You completed the symbol. What now? We must go back to the gate. She must go back. Behind us.
I feel like I don't have a lot of good stuff to say about Hellblade 2's actual gameplay, but before I get into that, I do have to stress that I didn't hate the way it played. It's just that it felt very repetitive very quickly, and for a 6 to 8 hour long game, that's not a good thing. If I had to break Hellblade 2 down into its key components, the stuff you're actually experiencing while sat in front of the screen, I'd say it could quite easily be split into 4 parts: cutscenes, combat, walking, and puzzles. These 4 parts are fairly self-explanatory, and they do flow well from one to the next while emerging naturally from the story, but they always feel like very familiar building blocks. To start with, the cutscenes here are not generally too long, but they are plentiful. To their credit, they are almost always beautifully framed and directed, while featuring great performances and delivering important story beats. But the problem I actually had with them in-game is that they blend so well with gameplay that it's hard to tell whether you're even in a cutscene or not. There were several times when I wasn't actually sure if I should or shouldn't be pressing buttons, and other times when I would be randomly mashing buttons only to realize that I'm not actually achieving anything. Often this would happen in the transition to a cutscene from walking. This game features an awful lot of walking, and while you are more often than not walking or sneaking through beautiful environments, it's still just walking, and it gets tiresome very quickly. It honestly felt like I permanently had my thumb pressed forward on the joystick and my forefinger held down on the left bumper to sprint. This was a problem with the first game too, and I feel like it might be worse here. I regularly felt like I was being forced to take lengthy routes to get anywhere, for no apparent reason other than padding out gameplay and providing a million opportunities to soak in the atmosphere. And again, that atmosphere is very good, but it's diluted by the sluggish traversal through this world. It really slows down the pace of the game, and it usually feels very on rails too, as does the combat. The combat in Hellblade II is very stylish, but it doesn't feel amazing. Clearly they went for a realistic approach here rather than making it arcadey, but that doesn't entirely work in its favour. Combat looks cinematic and cool, but it gives the player very little control over each battle. The big change from the first game here is that you focus on just one enemy at a time, rather than having to keep your eye on several around you. I don't mind this in theory, but in practice it just feels like you're fighting one enemy after the other in a row, and it's very one note. It almost feels like they chose to focus on making combat look awesome first, and making it fun was just a secondary goal. On top of that, while the first game featured several boss battles which required slightly different tactics and offered some level of variety, all of the fights here essentially feel the same. Plus, Hellblade 1's Dark Rot permadeath mechanic is absent here, which definitely takes some of the tension out of gameplay. And then there are Hellblade 2's puzzles. Much like in the first game, the main story will have you working through a lot of puzzles, which are primarily solved by moving around an area to get the right perspective and then unlocking some sort of path. There is, I think, a bit more variety here than in the first game, but still not enough. And chiefly, I think that's because the interactive mechanisms for these puzzles are just super basic. It's always interact with a thing here and then move around there to interact with that thing and then with that thing and then double back to the original thing, and then you move through to a new area and rinse and repeat. There are a couple of interesting twists, but they always feel the same because there's just never any thinking outside the box required. There are also some side puzzles you solve by finding faces in the rocks, and they're fine, but again, nothing new or particularly interesting. And honestly, all of these puzzles feel somewhat at odds with the cinematic ambitions of the game too. The player is constantly required to walk around in circles or step side to side and double back here and there, and it's always more frustrating than it is challenging. Even when you solve them quickly, Hellblade 2's story is repeatedly slowed almost to a halt by these repetitive puzzles.
How do you kill the sea giant? She can't. She doesn't know its real name. She needs to know more. You can only kill it if you find out more.
There's a golden rule that many writers and filmmakers live by, which is just 3 words. Show, don't tell. It's a simple dictate which I think aims primarily to avoid flat, boring exposition, and instead lead the reader or viewer to reach their own conclusions without holding their hand the whole way. It asks that the writer find a way, wherever possible, for the audience to experience a story rather than just be told it. I think then that if there was a game development version of this mantra, it would be something in the realm of let the game be played, not displayed. In other words, as much as possible, I think that any game should make the player feel immersed in the story through gameplay. After all, that is the unique aspect of the medium. And this doesn't mean you can't have lengthy cutscenes. It just means that the game shouldn't feel like it was just cutscenes. Take Metal Gear Solid 4 as a great example of a game with huge unplayable sections while still having immersive and interesting gameplay. I just think that for a game to justify being a game at all, it has to offer an experience which is improved by the nature of the medium itself. Now, I don't think that Hellblade 2 totally fails in this area. I do think there's enough interactivity that many players will engage with the story and connect with Senua, but I do think it could do a whole lot more, a lot better. Why does Hellblade 2 have to be a game and not a movie or a book or a chalk painting on the side of a house? In the end, I'm not sure it gives me enough reasons to convince me fully. The sound design is compelling, but I've seen similar things done in films before with arguably better results. The graphics are impressive here, but they are in several Unreal Engine tech demos too. The world is beautiful, but you never really have the agency to explore it in a meaningful way. The combat is thrilling, but it looks better than it plays. And the story is interesting, but it suffers from pacing issues because of the gameplay. It would likely feel a lot better edited into a 2 to 3 hour long film. I'm just not convinced that this game is fully committed to being a game. Hellblade 2 is a technical tour de force and an impressive artistic achievement, but it also feels like a game which isn't entirely sure what it wants to bring to the table or what it wants to be. It certainly could be an insanely impressive tech demo, but I also think the ingredients are there for a decent horror film. Its weakest point undoubtedly though is the gameplay, which often feels like a slog. It's one of those games where just seeing a narrow ledge up ahead in the distance will elicit a groan from many, as you realise you have to slowly shuffle along that ledge once again. In that way, it sort of feels like a really old game in a lovely new shell. It says a lot about how limited the gameplay is here, that on the controller the left and right triggers both do the same thing, and 3/4 of the D-pad isn't even used. And the quarter that is just activating photo mode. It really feels like Ninja Theory have done very little to iterate on the Hellblade gameplay experience over 7 years of development. It's as if they were somehow convinced that they had basically nailed it back then and they only had to improve the graphics. Or maybe they had no choice but to sacrifice gameplay in order to deliver the Xbox platform's most beautiful game, as was likely their mandate. And it would be fair to say that this is one of, if not the most next-gen looking games we've received this generation. It gave me, in many ways, the same feeling I had when I first played The Order 1886 or Rise Son of Rome. Like this was the game I knew I wanted to have downloaded to show off the power of this console. The difference here, of course, is that Hellblade 2 is a few years too late to be the Xbox Series X's debut graphical masterpiece. Nevertheless, as a technical showpiece, it does absolutely succeed. Unfortunately for Hellblade 2 though, great visuals alone do not a good game make. If you've played Hellblade 2 already, I'd love to know what you think about it in the comments. And please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk about more video game stuff. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.